Do you remember what you said to me?" The words hung in the air, soft but unshakable, as flashing red and blue lights painted the wet asphalt in restless streaks, and Officer Daniel Brooks stood there, his breath shallow, his authority slipping through his fingers in a way he didn't yet understand, because just minutes earlier everything had felt certain, controlled, predictable, the way it always did on quiet roads like this one. The kind that stretched for miles under dim streetlights where nothing ever happened unless someone like him decided it did. And that night he had decided. The moment he saw the old sedan drift slightly over the center line. The moment his eyes caught a glimpse of the driver through the rain-streaked glass. He had already made up his mind before the siren ever sounded. Because sometimes power doesn't ask questions, it assumes. And when Evelyn Carter pulled over onto the gravel shoulder, her hands steady on the wheel, the world seemed to narrow into that single moment where judgment moved. Faster than truth. The engine ticking softly as it cooled, the faint hum of tires passing in the distance, and the slow, deliberate rhythm of rain tapping against the windshield like a quiet warning no one was listening to. She took a breath before reaching for her purse, not in panic but in calm. The kind of calm that comes from a life lived through storms far heavier than this one. While outside, Brooks stepped out of his cruiser, adjusting his jacket, his posture already firm with the confidence of someone who had never been questioned, his boots crunching against wet gravel as he approached the driver's side. And without hesitation he knocked sharply on the window, the sound cutting through the stillness. "License and registration," he said, his voice flat, practiced, leaving no room for anything but compliance. And when the window rolled down just enough for the rain to slip inside, he saw her clearly for the first time. An elderly black woman, silver hair pulled neatly back, eyes steady behind simple glasses, her presence quiet but composed in a way that didn't match the story he had already written in his mind. "Officer," she said gently, her voice even. There must be some mistake. But Brooks didn't hear concern. He heard deflection. He heard what he expected to hear, because expectation can be louder than truth when you let it. And he leaned slightly closer, his tone sharpening just enough to shift the air between them. "Step out of the vehicle," he said, and for a brief moment, just a fraction of a second, something passed through her expression, not fear, not confusion, but recognition, as if she had seen this moment before in a different form, in a different room, under a different kind of light. And still she complied, opening the door slowly, stepping out into the rain with measured grace, her shoes touching the gravel as if the ground itself deserved respect, while in the distance a pair of headlights slowed, curiosity already building in the shadows. And Brooks, unaware of the weight of the moment he was creating, unaware of the quiet shift already beginning to unfold around him, gestured toward the back of the car, believing he was in control of every second that followed, not knowing that control, real control, doesn't announce itself with flashing lights or raised voices. It waits, silent and patient, for the exact moment when everything changes. The rain did not let up as Evelyn Carter stood beside her car, the steady rhythm of droplets tapping against the metal roof blending with the low static from Officer Brooks's radio, a sound that seemed small, but carried an undercurrent of tension he chose not to notice, because in his mind this was routine, another stop, another situation already decided before it began, and he gestured again, more firmly this time, directing her toward the rear of the vehicle as if every movement she made needed his permission to exist. While a pair of headlights slowed further down the road, then another, the quiet highway no longer as empty as it had been moments before, curiosity pulling people closer in ways that always happened when authority raised its voice in public, and Evelyn moved without resistance, her posture straight despite the chill in the air, her coat lightly dampened by the rain, her hands visible, calm, composed, never rushing, never trembling, a presence that did not match the narrative forming in Brooks's mind. And that mismatch irritated him more than he realized, because he had learned to expect reactions, nervousness, defensiveness, something that confirmed his assumptions. But she offered none of that, only a steady gaze that met his without challenge yet without submission, and for a brief second it unsettled him in a way he could not explain. So he filled that silence the only way he knew how, with control, asking questions in a clipped tone, where she was coming from, where she was headed, why she had crossed the line, each question less about information and more about reinforcing the position he believed he held. And she answered simply, clearly, without hesitation, her voice even. "I was driving home," she said, "just a few miles ahead." And he nodded as if the answer did not matter, already stepping past her toward the driver's door, shining his light inside the car, scanning the interior not for evidence, but for confirmation of a story he had already written, and the beam passed over a neatly folded coat, a leather folder resting on the passenger seat, a pair of reading glasses, ordinary details that should have ended the moment, but instead seemed to deepen his suspicions simply because they did not align with what he expected to find. And behind them, the faint glow of another vehicle pulling closer cast long shadows across the road, a driver slowing just enough to watch. Phone already raised, while Brooks spoke into his radio, requesting a secondary unit, his voice steady but edged with something sharper now, something that hinted at escalation. And when he turned back toward Evelyn, there was a shift, subtle but real, the kind of shift that happens when an assumption begins to harden into action. "I need you to place your hands where I can see them," he said, even though they already were, even though nothing in her behavior justified the command beyond the authority he carried. And she complied again, lifting her hands slightly, her expression unchanged, as if she understood something he did not, as if she could already see the path this moment was taking long before he reached its end. And the rain continued to fall, steady, relentless, washing over the scene as more lights gathered in the distance, the quiet road transforming into a stage neither of them had intended. And still Brooks pressed forward, unaware that every step he took was moving him closer to a line he could not see, a line that once crossed would not be undone by explanations or apologies, a line that would reveal not just who she was, but who he had chosen to be in the moment it mattered most. The sound of approaching tires grew louder as another patrol car rolled in, its headlights cutting through the rain and settling behind Officer Brooks's cruiser, casting long overlapping beams that stretched across the wet pavement like silent witnesses. And for a moment the scene shifted, no longer just a routine stop, but something heavier, something watched, something recorded, because now there were eyes, real eyes, from passing drivers who had slowed to a crawl, from someone standing just beyond the shoulder holding up a phone, from the second officer stepping out of the newly arrived vehicle, adjusting his cap as he took in the situation with a quick, assessing glance. And Brooks straightened slightly, his posture tightening, as if the presence of another uniform required him to reinforce the version of events he had already committed to. "She crossed the line back there," he said, his tone firm, controlled, leaving no space for doubt. But the second officer, younger, quieter, did not immediately respond, his gaze flicking briefly toward Evelyn, then back to Brooks, then again toward the car, taking in details that did not align as neatly as the explanation suggested. And in that brief hesitation something shifted, subtle but undeniable, the kind of hesitation that plants the first seed of uncertainty. And Brooks felt it even if he could not name it, so he moved faster, stepping closer to Evelyn, his voice sharpening just enough to reclaim control, asking again for identification, more insistently now, and she nodded, her movements slow but deliberate as she reached into her coat pocket, the fabric damp from the rain, her fingers steady as they retrieved a small leather case, worn at the edges but carefully kept, and she held it for a moment before handing it over, not rushed, not hesitant, simply certain. And Brooks took it with a quick motion, flipping it open under the beam of his flashlight, his eyes scanning the contents with the expectation of confirmation. But what he saw did not immediately register, because sometimes the truth does not fit the shape of the assumption. And when that happens, the mind does not accept it. It resists it, reshapes it, questions it before it allows itself to understand. And so he looked again, slower this time, his brow tightening slightly as the name settled in front of him. Evelyn Carter, the words clear, official, accompanied by credentials that did not belong to the narrative he had built. And for a brief second the rain seemed louder, the air heavier, as if the world itself had paused to see what he would do next. But instead of stepping back, instead of allowing the moment to unfold, he closed the case with a small, decisive motion, his voice returning, firm, dismissive. "Step over here," he said, gesturing toward the rear of the car again, as if the document had changed nothing, as if authority could override reality simply by refusing to acknowledge it. And the younger officer shifted slightly, his uncertainty now more visible, his eyes moving between Brooks and Evelyn, then back to the closed leather case still in Brooks's hand, a detail that lingered just long enough to matter, while in the distance another set of lights approached, slower, darker, more deliberate, and Evelyn watched it all with the same quiet composure, her expression unchanged, her posture steady despite the weight of the moment pressing in from every direction, because she understood something Brooks did not, something he could not yet see, that truth does not need to announce itself loudly to exist, it only needs time. And as the rain continued to fall and the gathered lights reflected across the pavement, that time was running out for him faster than he realized. The leather case felt heavier in Officer Brooks's hand than it should have, not because of its weight, but because of what it suggested. Something he was not ready to accept, and instead of opening it again, he slipped it into his palm, as if holding it too long might force him to confront what he had already seen. While the second officer shifted closer, his voice lower now, almost cautious, asking quietly if everything checked out, and Brooks answered too quickly, too firmly, "It is nothing," as if dismissing the question could erase the doubt that had already entered the space between them, and the rain continued to fall. Steady, patient, as more headlights gathered along the roadside, their beams reflecting off the wet pavement and turning the scene into something brighter than it should have been, something exposed, because moments like this rarely stayed private once attention found them, and Evelyn Carter remained where she stood, her hands relaxed at her sides now, her gaze moving briefly toward the approaching lights before returning to Brooks, not with defiance, but with a kind of quiet awareness that seemed to measure time differently, as if she already knew how this would unfold, and that certainty unsettled him more than any argument could have. So he doubled down, stepping back slightly, raising his radio again, his voice controlled but sharper now as he spoke into it, requesting confirmation, requesting verification, using words that sounded procedural but carried a weight of urgency he would not admit. And for a moment there was only static, the faint crackle filling the silence while the second officer watched, his attention no longer fixed on Evelyn but on Brooks, on the way his posture had changed, on the way certainty had begun to fracture into something else, something less stable. And when the response finally came through the radio, it was not loud, not dramatic, just a voice on the other end asking him to repeat the name. And he hesitated, just briefly, just enough for it to be noticed, before speaking it again, Evelyn Carter, and the name seemed to hang there, longer than it should have, as if it carried meaning beyond the syllables, and the voice on the other end went quiet for a second, then returned with a tone that was no longer casual, no longer routine, asking him to stand by, asking him not to proceed. And that was the moment something inside him shifted, not outwardly, not yet, but internally, where certainty had lived just minutes before, now replaced by a growing awareness that he might have misread something fundamental. And still, instead of stepping back, he held his ground, because stepping back would mean admitting that the line had already been crossed. And people like him were not trained to admit that easily. So he lowered the radio slowly, his eyes returning to Evelyn, searching her face for something that would restore the balance he had lost. But all he found was the same calm expression, unchanged, steady, as if she had been standing in that moment far longer than he had. And in the distance, the darker set of headlights that had been approaching finally came into view, not slowing like the others, not hesitating, but moving with intention, pulling in behind the patrol cars with a quiet authority that did not need to announce itself loudly to be understood. And the air shifted again, heavier now, more deliberate, as doors opened and figures stepped out, their movements precise, their presence unmistakable even before a word was spoken, and Brooks felt it before he fully saw it. That subtle but undeniable realization that whatever control he believed he had was no longer his to hold. And yet he stood there, caught between the version of events he had created and the reality that was now unfolding around him. A reality that was no longer asking for his permission to exist. The doors of the dark vehicles closed with a quiet precision that carried more weight than any siren. And as the figures stepped forward into the glow of the flashing patrol lights, the atmosphere changed in a way that no one needed to explain. Because authority has a presence that does not need to raise its voice to be understood, and the younger officer instinctively straightened, his uncertainty now replaced with a subtle awareness that this moment had shifted beyond routine, while Officer Brooks remained still, his hand tightening slightly around the leather case he had not returned, his mind moving quickly but without direction, trying to piece together what he had already seen with what was now unfolding in front of him. And one of the arriving individuals, dressed in a dark overcoat that moved slightly with the wind, approached with measured steps, his eyes scanning the scene not with curiosity, but with purpose. And when he spoke, his voice was calm, controlled, carrying the kind of clarity that comes from knowing exactly what is at stake. "Officer, we need you to step aside for a moment," he said, not as a suggestion, but as a directive, and Brooks hesitated, just briefly, his instincts pushing back against the request, because stepping aside meant relinquishing control, meant acknowledging that this was no longer his situation to manage. But the pause lasted only a second before he shifted slightly, not fully stepping away, but enough to create the appearance of cooperation, and the man's attention moved past him, directly to Evelyn, his posture softening almost imperceptibly. "Ma'am," he said with quiet respect, "are you all right?" And the question itself carried more weight than the words, because it recognized her position without announcing it to the entire road, and Evelyn nodded gently, her voice steady. "I am fine," she said, her tone unchanged, as if the rain, the lights, the tension had never altered her sense of balance. And the man inclined his head slightly before turning back, his gaze now meeting Brooks's fully. And in that look there was no hostility, no raised emotion, only a firm understanding that something had gone wrong, something that would need to be addressed carefully but without delay. And behind them the second officer shifted again, his attention now fixed on Brooks, waiting, watching, as if the responsibility for what came next rested entirely on the choices already made. And Brooks felt it, that pressure building in a way he had never experienced during a stop like this. Because the situation was no longer responding to his commands, it was unfolding according to something larger, something structured, something that did not bend easily to assumption. And for the first time that night, he opened the leather case again, slower this time, his eyes returning to the name, to the credentials, to the reality he had tried to dismiss. And the recognition settled deeper now, heavier, impossible to ignore, while the man in the overcoat spoke again, his voice lower, more direct. "Do you understand who you have stopped?" And the question was not rhetorical, it was precise, demanding clarity, and Brooks did not answer immediately, because the answer required more than words. It required acceptance, and acceptance was the one thing he had resisted since the moment this began. And the rain continued to fall, steady, unchanging, as the gathered lights reflected across the road, and the quiet observers remained in place, their phones still raised, their attention fixed, because moments like this do not disappear once they begin. They expand, they deepen, they reveal more than anyone expects. And Evelyn stood at the center of it all, calm, composed, her presence unchanged, as if she had simply allowed the moment to reach its natural conclusion. And Brooks, standing just a few feet away, felt the shift fully now, the realization that authority without understanding is fragile, and that what he had mistaken for control had never truly been his to hold in the first place. The question lingered in the air longer than the rain itself, pressing against Officer Brooks in a way no command ever had, because this was not a situation he could direct or contain with a raised voice or a firm stance. This was a moment that demanded something far more difficult, recognition. And as the man in the overcoat held his gaze, waiting without impatience, Brooks felt the silence stretch, each second exposing the gap between what he believed and what was now undeniable. And when he finally spoke, his voice was lower, stripped of its earlier certainty. I am confirming," he said, but even as the words left his mouth they sounded hollow, because confirmation had already happened, not through the radio, not through procedure, but through the evidence he had chosen to ignore. And the man nodded slightly, not as approval but as acknowledgement, then extended his hand calmly. "The identification, please." And for a moment Brooks hesitated again, his fingers tightening around the leather case, as if letting it go would finalize something he could not undo. But the hesitation did not last, because every set of eyes around him now carried the same quiet expectation, and slowly, deliberately, he handed it over, the small motion marking a shift far greater than it appeared. And as the man opened the case under the soft beam of a nearby light, there was no confusion in his expression, no doubt, only confirmation of what he already knew, and he closed it with care. Before turning back toward Evelyn, his posture straightening, his tone respectful in a way that carried both professionalism and understanding. "Justice Carter," he said quietly, the title spoken not loudly but clearly enough to change the entire atmosphere, and the words moved through the scene like a current, subtle but undeniable, reaching the younger officer first, whose eyes widened slightly as the realization settled in, then the onlookers, whose murmurs shifted into something more focused, more aware, and finally Brooks himself, who stood there as the title echoed in his mind, reshaping everything that had happened in the past 10 minutes into something he could no longer defend or reinterpret. And Evelyn inclined her head slightly, not in acknowledgement of the authority around her, but in simple recognition of the truth now spoken aloud, her voice calm as ever. "Good evening," she said, as if the moment had always been destined to arrive here, and the man in the overcoat turned back toward Brooks, his expression composed but firm. "Officer, we will handle this from here," he said, and there was no room in the statement for argument, not because of force, but because of clarity, and Brooks felt it fully now, the complete transfer of control, the understanding that whatever narrative he had constructed was no longer relevant in the presence of reality. And behind him, the second officer took a small step back, instinctively creating distance from a situation that had shifted beyond his involvement, while the rain continued its steady fall, indifferent to titles or positions, washing over the road as if to erase the sharp edges of the moment. And yet nothing about this would be erased, because moments like this leave something behind, something that does not fade with time or explanation. And Brooks lowered his gaze briefly, the weight of the realization settling in, not as a sudden collapse, but as a slow, undeniable recognition that authority without awareness is fragile, and that the line he had crossed was not marked by flashing lights or commands, but by the quiet assumption that he understood what he had never taken the time to see. The title settled over the scene like a quiet verdict, not shouted, not forced, but undeniable in its presence. And for a moment, everything seemed to slow, the rain softening against the pavement, the flashing lights losing their urgency, as if even they understood that something irreversible had just been revealed. And Officer Brooks stood there, no longer directing the moment, but caught inside it, his earlier certainty now replaced by a silence he could not fill, because there was nothing left to assert, nothing left to correct without first acknowledging what had already happened. And the man in the overcoat stepped slightly closer to Evelyn, his tone respectful, measured, asking if she wished to continue on her way or remain while the situation was addressed. And she considered the question for a brief second, her gaze shifting across the scene, taking in the gathered officers, the distant observers, the quiet tension that still lingered, before returning to him. "I will stay," she said gently, not as a demand but as a choice, and that choice carried weight, because it meant the moment would not simply pass. It would be seen, understood, and remembered. And Brooks felt that realization settle deeper, the understanding that this was no longer about a traffic stop, it was about accountability. And the younger officer, standing just behind him, shifted again, his posture now clearly distant, no longer aligned with Brooks, but with the structure that had just revealed itself. And the road, once empty, now held a quiet audience. Drivers paused at a distance, their headlights forming a line of silent witnesses, phones still raised, capturing a moment that had already begun to ripple beyond this stretch of asphalt. And Brooks finally spoke, his voice lower than before, stripped of the sharp edges that had defined it earlier. "Ma'am," he said, the word unfamiliar in his mouth now, not as a formality but as a recognition. And he paused, searching for something more to say, something that could reshape what had already been done, but language failed him in that moment. Because some actions do not leave space for immediate correction. They require time, reflection, and consequence. And Evelyn met his gaze briefly, not with anger, not with triumph, but with a calm that seemed to hold a deeper understanding of what this moment represented. and she did not respond, not because she had nothing to say, but because she did not need to, her silence carrying more clarity than any words could offer. And the man in the overcoat turned back toward Brooks, his tone steady. "We will need a full report," he said, simple, direct, and Brooks nodded slightly, the motion small but significant. Because it was the first time that night he responded without resistance, without assumption, and as he lowered his gaze again the rain continued to fall, washing over the road, the cars, the lights, but not the moment itself, because moments like this do not disappear with the weather. They remain, shaping what comes next in ways that are not always immediate, but always lasting. And as the quiet hum of engines and the soft murmur of distant voices filled the air, the scene held its place. Suspended between what had happened and what would follow, with one truth now fully visible to everyone present, that authority is not proven in how it is used, but in how it is understood, and that understanding had arrived too late for the moment that had already passed. The rain softened into a steady whisper as the scene settled into something quieter but far more permanent, the kind of silence that does not come from absence of sound, but from the weight of realization settling over everyone present. And Officer Brooks remained where he stood, no longer trying to direct the moment, his posture less rigid now, as if the structure he relied on had shifted beneath him, leaving him to face something he had not prepared for. And across from him Evelyn Carter stood unchanged, her composure untouched by the tension that had filled the last several minutes, her presence steady in a way that made the flashing lights and gathered attention feel almost distant, as if none of it had the power to alter who she was. And the man in the overcoat spoke quietly with another arriving official near the vehicles, their voices low but precise, carrying the tone of people who understood both the gravity of the situation and the necessity of handling it with care, because this was no longer a private moment. It had become something observed, something documented, something that would exist beyond this road. And the younger officer took a step further back, creating more distance, his eyes no longer meeting Brooks's, not out of disrespect, but out of recognition that alignment had shifted, that roles had changed in a way that could not be reversed simply by returning to routine. And Brooks finally moved, just slightly, his hand dropping to his side, his gaze lifting once more toward Evelyn. And when he spoke again his voice carried a different tone, one that was no longer anchored in authority, but in something closer to understanding. "I did not know," he said, the words simple but heavy, not as an excuse but as a statement of fact that no longer held the power it once did. And Evelyn regarded him for a moment, her expression thoughtful, not judging, not dismissive, but reflective, as if considering not just his words but the meaning behind them. And when she responded her voice remained calm, steady, carrying the clarity of someone who has seen this pattern before. "That is often the case," she said, and the sentence lingered in the air, not harsh, not accusatory, but undeniably precise, because it pointed to something deeper than this single moment, something that existed long before it, and would continue after. And Brooks lowered his gaze briefly, absorbing the weight of that truth, the realization that not knowing had never been the real issue, that assumption had filled the space where understanding should have been. And the man in the overcoat stepped forward again, his attention returning to Brooks, outlining the next steps in a tone that remained professional but firm, explaining that the incident would be reviewed, that reports would be filed, that processes would follow as they were meant to. And Brooks nodded again, this time without hesitation, because there was nothing left to resist. And the road, once quiet and empty, now held a memory that would not fade with the rain. The gathered observers slowly beginning to move on, their vehicles pulling away, one by one, but not before capturing the moment that had unfolded. And as the flashing lights dimmed slightly and the tension eased into something more controlled, Evelyn turned toward her car, her movements as measured as they had been from the beginning. And before stepping inside, she paused briefly, her gaze shifting back to Brooks one final time, not with anger, not with triumph, but with a calm that carried a quiet finality, as if to mark the end of one moment and the beginning of another. And though she said nothing more, the silence itself spoke clearly, because some lessons are not delivered through words, they are left to settle, to take root, to be understood over time. And as the door closed and the engine started softly, The rain continued to fall, steady and unchanging, washing over the road as if nothing had happened, yet leaving behind something that would remain long after the water dried. A truth that once seen could not be unseen, that authority without awareness is incomplete, and that real understanding does not arrive in the moment of control, but in the moment when control is taken away. The taillights of Evelyn Carter's car faded slowly into the distance, swallowed by the rain and the long stretch of dark highway ahead, and for a moment no one moved, as if the entire scene needed time to catch up with what had just happened, because moments like this do not end when the car drives away. They linger, they settle into the space left behind, and Officer Brooks remains standing near the shoulder, the flashing lights now dimmer, less urgent, reflecting off the wet pavement in softer patterns that no longer commanded attention but instead revealed it. And the road, once filled with quiet observers, had begun to empty, vehicles pulling away one by one, their engines fading into the night, leaving behind only the officers, the rain, and the weight of what could not be undone. And Brooks finally exhaled, a slow breath he did not realize he had been holding, his shoulders lowering slightly as the tension that had driven his every movement earlier now gave way to something heavier, something quieter, and far more difficult to ignore. And he looked down at his hands for a brief second, as if expecting to see something different there, something that explained how quickly certainty had turned into doubt, and then into understanding. And the younger officer, who had kept his distance, stepped forward just enough to be heard, his voice careful, measured. "You did not recognize her," he said, not as an accusation but as a reflection, and Brooks nodded faintly, the motion small, almost imperceptible, because the truth in that statement extended far beyond recognition. It reached into something deeper, something that had shaped the moment long before the stop began, and the man in the overcoat remained nearby, speaking quietly into his phone now, his tone controlled, outlining the situation with the clarity of someone who understood that every detail mattered, that every word would carry weight once it left this road and entered rooms where decisions were made. And Brooks listened without meaning to, catching fragments of phrases, incident, review, procedure, words that felt distant just minutes ago but now seemed inevitable. And he realized then that this moment was no longer his to define. It would be examined, understood, and remembered by others, and that realization settled in with a quiet finality. And he took a step back from the roadside, the gravel shifting under his boots, the sound small but grounding. And for the first time that night, he allowed himself to replay the moment from the beginning, not through the lens of control, but through the lens of what had actually been there, the steady voice, the composed posture, the absence of fear, all the signs he had overlooked because they did not match what he expected to see. And the rain continued to fall, washing over the scene as if trying to soften its edges, but nothing about it softened what remained in his mind, because understanding does not arrive as comfort, it arrives as clarity, and clarity has a way of staying long after everything else fades. And the younger officer turned away, returning to his vehicle, the distance between them now defined not by space but by awareness. And the man in the overcoat ended his call, glancing once more at Brooks before stepping back toward the dark vehicle, his expression unchanged, because his role had been to ensure the truth was recognized, not to shape how it was felt. And Brooks stood there alone for a moment, the flashing lights now reduced to a quiet pulse behind him, and he looked down the road where the car had disappeared, the darkness stretching endlessly ahead. And in that silence, he understood something he had never been forced to face before, that authority without understanding is not power, it is exposure, and that the moment he believed he was in control had been the moment he revealed how little he truly saw. And the rain fell steadily, marking time in a way that felt almost deliberate, as if reminding him that every action leaves something behind, something that cannot be erased by distance or explanation. And as he finally turned back toward his cruiser, the weight of that realization followed him, not loudly, not dramatically, but with a quiet persistence that would remain long after the lights were turned off and the road returned to its silence. Because some lessons do not end when the moment is over, they begin there, and they echo in ways that shape everything that comes after.